Me and my parents were visiting my aunt, who was getting quite along at an age that I needed help deciding what was going to happen to her after she was gone. She didn't have any surviving family that would inherit her place, so, to keep all the others from squabbling it was decided that it would be a good idea for her and my dad, and perhaps even my mother, to sit down together and talk about a good procedure to follow when the house was no longer in her hands. I was only 16 at the time, but I wasn't necessarily invited to be part of the proceedings that would take place with the committee. So, I was encouraged to stay out of the way, preferably by playing outside. Well, I was 16, so I didn't have any plans to play outside. Maybe take a brooding teenage introspective walk. My aunt stopped me as I had my foot in the door. She told me that it would be smart if I watched myself carefully. The garden, she explained, wasn't off limits, but I didn't need to be careful. She wouldn't explain why. I would ask her, but she would just kind of shrug her shoulders. I wasn't sure what to make of it, so I more or less forgot about what she said as soon as I had stepped outside. It was a beautiful house and a nice property. The more I wandered around, the more I could see why she had spent so much time there by herself. It wasn't a mansion by far, but it was big enough that you could be satisfied to either roam around inside or outside. Both the garden and the general yard was very spacious. I came to the edge, where the plants were almost as ancient as the stones that dotted it. It was then that I remembered my aunts telling me to be careful in the garden. I looked for anything that seemed like it could have easily been broken or fragile, but I saw no such thing. Anything that wasn't a plant was made out of solid rock and was masterfully carved, if not somewhat dated. I looked for anything I could that I would hurt myself on, period. Nothing was pointy or sharp. I saw no such possibility, and so I was very puzzled over why my own aunt would tell me to be careful. I absently began strolling around the confines of the garden, more put at ease than off by it. It was laid out in a strange circular design. The central was beautiful, as it was carved, but slightly unusual. It was made in the form of a larger dog, but there was something wrong about the whole thing. Its entire body looked like porous volcanic rock, and the scale of this thing was immense. It was more the size of a black bear than a dog, and its face was a frozen, horrible expression of rage, and its back was even arched. The most puzzling detail about the sculpture was its eyes, or lack thereof. Maybe it had defined eyes at one point in time, but the decades of being weathered by the elements had clearly rubbed them away. Any detail of eyes were lost among the pocks and holes natural to the volcanic rock. While I was studying the bizarre dog statue, in that time that it took me to naturally blink and open my eyes, the head had gone from staring straight ahead to turning and looking at me. I jumped out of my skin, but somehow managed not to yelp. 2 points of light behind 2 pinhole-sized pockmarks in the dog's head lit up like cherries, giving the sculpture to glowing eyes for just a few seconds before burning out again. Before I could seriously think that I was going crazy, I could smell the stink of molten, burning rock. I promptly went inside and stayed there, but I stayed quiet so that I wouldn't be discovered right away. I made myself known when I could tell that the discussions about the fate of the property were over. Before leaving, my aunt told me to come to her side, as she had a question. She asked me if I would be interested in possessing the property if she passed on. I declined as politely as possible, and she gave me the strangest, perhaps the eeriest smile I had ever seen her make, and she told me that she understood. So how do I go around openly telling people what just happened to me? I can't. Nobody will believe me. In fact, I'm probably even sending this to you in vain. So, Here's to hopes you actually take me seriously. I have an extensive history of night terrors. They are frightening, and if you share them, then you know what I mean. You often feel like you're being brought within inches of your life when you go to sleep. Most of them, luckily, are confirmed to be hallucinations. Me, I'm not always so sure that what I experienced is all in my head. The short explanation is that you wake up in a state where your body is physiologically asleep, but your mind is mostly awake. The dream switch is still activated, so you are paralyzed and still being piped vivid imagery from your mind. But you're awake and aware, so that the real and the dream overlap, mostly in horrifying and awful ways. It's not unusual for people to report being weighed down by all kinds of entities, gray aliens, old hags, whatever nightmare creature described. They all perform the same function. A rational explanation for why your body can't move. So, that's why I'm inclined to think that some of what I experienced isn't just my nighttime functions proceeding as normal. The things that I've been seeing have started appearing a little bit before I'm even in bed. This began about a month ago, when I started having night terrors that would take the form of a large dog that felt like it weighed 2 tons. I expected to hear my ribs cracking whenever it jumped onto the bed. That horrible thing became a nightly visitor. Then, it took a step further and started appearing in my doorway as soon as I'd get into bed. Nobody could see it but me. It would disappear when I called for my parents. Then, it started sticking around and watching my parents enter and leave the room. Then, it would flash me a grin of teeth that looked like long white ice picks, and its eyes would always glow like 2 red laser pointers. Each time it jumped on the bed, it was worse. It was getting heavier. Then it would get hot. And at first, a terrible smell accompanied it, like death and rot. Things that you should not be able to smell while supposedly dreaming. But then it started smelling like the room was on fire. I'd be in a panic, thinking that the house was on fire when I'd smell this thing. It took this dimension of things even further and began giving off an awful stink of sulfur, like rotten eggs but more intense. Then, it began heating up the bed until I felt like I was being burned and crushed and suffocated simultaneously. I would tell my parents about it every single day, and they did get concerned for a bit, but then they just started getting annoyed. Telling them about it each day got more eye rolls than support. It wasn't like I had any way of proving the thing actually existed. The horrible dog's visits began to taper off the older I got, but they did not stop completely. That is, until I moved out of the house. Recently, my parents had begun to renovate the house to prepare it for the market, so they could downsize to something smaller and easier to manage. My father, against my mother's wishes, let me in on something that they found in the walls of what was my room. Tucked inside was a skull, possibly a monkey's, that was inscribed with all kinds of evil-looking symbols and markings. I'm no occultist, but I did see a demonic-looking rune on the brimstone underneath the left eye of the skull. My father gave me the most awkward apology possible. It was better than nothing. My mother didn't even want to admit that such awful things was inside their home, and that it had plagued me right under her nose for years, and she never took me seriously. Not once. So, do you feel like this occultic artifact could be the reasoning I've been having these demonic sightings over the years? I know nothing of the history of this house, or anyone who had owned it prior, or anything they did. It must have been old, since it was put behind old sheetrock that my dad had to tear out to redo that part of the wall. Anyway, that's my experience. I hope you enjoyed my story. I was walking along my favorite trail in the woods. It was a public reserve that got plenty of regular traffic, so it's not the sort of place you would visit and expect to see anything unusual. I knew the trails like the back of my own hand, having gone on them so much. So, it occurred to me to start looking for pathways off the trails that might not be so obvious. Perhaps I could discover some new dimensions to my more than familiar stomping grounds. So, I began heading off the trail at random points, with no real rhyme or reason, just looking to see if I could possibly end up someplace new and exciting. I discovered a worn path that was noticeable only because the thorns surrounding it were laying a bit lower than the others from traffic. This was certainly not a part of the reserve I had seen before, so my excitement grew instantly. The further down the path I went, the more my clothes got caught in the brambles and thorns, and I got this strange paranoid feeling that something didn't want me to continue down the trail. A most ridiculous notion, and very irrational. I just needed to lose weight, so that there was less of me for the plants to grab onto. The trail became more cramped and choked, and my calves were starting to look like raw hamburger, which served me right for heading off the trail in shorts, I guess. And just like that, the trail opened up into a clearing where the husk of some old shed stood. My heart threatened to stop in my chest when I saw what was inside. It looked to be like some sort of black fire churning and swirling, just like something out of a nightmarish storybook. And a set of red eyes looked at me, and then another set, and yet a third. The fire appeared to be divided into 3 separate masses, each with their own set of hellish red eyes. They began moving towards me, revealing what they had been sitting on. It was a body, badly bloated and purple. I don't know anything about autopsies, but I'm pretty sure I saw that her throat had been cut. Whether it was a knife or by some power of 3 phantoms that began moving towards me, I wasn't sure. The closer they got, the more I could see that they had the overall shape of dogs, though they were big enough to be bears. From their blackness glinted sharp teeth besides their eyes. Their bodies were appearing to be in black flames that also had these bizarre movements that nearly made them look like tentacle-like appendages. The stench of the body blended with the smells of the burning smoke. In complete and utter terror, I fled. I reported the body without a moment's hesitation, and I was questioned as a matter of course. And the questions kept coming back to me. And apparently, this was the doing of some cult in the area. Apparently, they'd been having issues for years, and nobody had bothered to report on them or make the public aware. When I was cleared of any involvement, a polite detective chatted me up a little and told me that this was by far the cult's most visible act yet. So much so that they wondered if it was a botched job by an initiate, which is why I was questioned. On top of all that, the girl found dead, while her name wasn't released to the public that I'm aware of, was actually found to be a member of that same cult. Interesting. I thought I would share this with you, because it's my only experience I've ever had in life that I actually dealt with demons and the supernatural in a physical manifestation. The beings that I saw that chased after me, I believe firmly, without a doubt, these were demons, hellhounds to be exact. Why they were attached to this dead body, I'm not sure. Maybe it was some sort of cult ritual. Maybe, just maybe. I work in a prison. I'd like to say that it's rewarding, that I get to see men change from animals to civilized human beings who realized what they've done and spend the rest of their lives making up for it. But this is Super Max, filled with the worst kind of humankind. And it pays well. Lots of bennies. That's the only reason I do this. Having been a CO for quite some time, you see a lot. We have a lot of death in here. As hard as we try, there are always times the cons manage to get each other, and there are a lot of gangbangers doing life. And although they are meant to be kept separate, for our safety as much as theirs, they got people doing their bidding all over. But this is all expected. Then, you add in all the usual illnesses that come from a weird lifestyle, and just the usual age stuff when you got crazy old lifers in here. And sometimes, I get the chance to foresee it. But not in a clairvoyant way, like I may have made it seem. I get a visitor. The first time that it happened, I won't lie, it was the single most terrifying thing that I have ever experienced. It topped being trapped in a room with a cannibal serial killer who had broken his restraints. I was outside doing a perimeter check, as it was early evening and close to lockdown. Back in the cage, buddy time. Very occasionally, one of the guests likes to try and spend a bit more time in the open air, so we always check. It was a pretty cool evening. I remember that I could see my breath. Then this awful smell hit me. It reminded me of science class back in high school, when one of the senior guards had been eating deviled eggs. I recognized the smell as sulfur, like I had somehow known. Still, obnoxious smells can't detract us from the job. Otherwise, none of us would work in Cell D after they've served chili in the canteen. So on I went, the smell growing stronger, and then I heard the growl. Some Super Maxes are smack bang in the middle of cities. Ours is pretty secluded. You don't have to drive too far to get back into civilization. It's around a 30-minute journey back to my place. But there isn't much actually around here, so it's not unusual for animals to come sniffing around. Therefore, a growl from the other side of the secure fencing was by no means anything for me to be concerned about. I could just about make out the form of a large dog, and it was large. That thing sure wasn't wild and feeding off what little scraps it could find. At the point, it had its back to me, so I could not see the face, just the huge hulking jet black body that looked more like a wolf than your regular dog. And then it turned and faced me. I'm no expert, but I sure as hell ain't no writer. When I looked into this being's eyes, I felt hell. Fire. Satan. Don't ask me how it's possible. This thing just oozed malevolence. A harbinger of death. It's like my inner spirit just knew that this was a hellhound. It appeared to be gazing into my soul, the fires of its eyes burning into me. I thought I was dead, that it would leap through the fence or leap through it and get me. It looked like it probably had some sort of superpower that could do that. But instead, it bared its teeth, heckles up, growling. Then it gave a horrendous growl and seemed to just kind of evaporate into air. It didn't turn and run, nor did it disappear. It simply kind of just vanished, much in the same way that vapor dissipates. It was terrifying, to say the least. I might have remained standing there like an idiot if my radio had not suddenly come to life, scaring me. Good job I got a strong heart. There was a panicked message coming through from one of the newer guys. He'd been doing his regular patrol when he slipped and fell. When he looked down to see what had caused his mishap, it was blood. And the blood he had fallen into had come from a now very much deceased body of a particularly child molester who had been shanked. Protocol and cleanup took precedent for a while then, and I almost forgot about old Red Eyes outside. I did some research on the internet as soon as I could, and thanks to some anonymous discussion via Reddit and other sources, I discovered the phenomena of the hellhound. Since that day, I've seen this demonic entity 3 more times, always around certain areas where some of the most evil and sinister prisoners are. I have never mentioned it to anybody else, but one time, the sighting was in the perfect place to have been caught on camera. So after our visit, and the inevitable cleanup of a gang member who liked to torture the family members of his rivals, choked to death after being force-fed his own fingers. But of course there was nothing. Just me, stood staring at the fence. There's only so many people I can send this to, and not lose my career and be taken seriously. So, people like paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and people like you, who take time to read other people's stories and encounters. While I'm sure you get many counterfeit stories, I hope that mine, the genuinity in it, can stick out above the rest. And whoever hears this, if you decide to read it, can feel brave enough to come forth with theirs. No matter how fake it sounds, there is always somebody out there who will denounce your claims as fake. My brother is a scout leader, and every so often, he takes the kids camping out in the woods. He loves it. They love it. My nephews are a part of his troop, and even his wife goes along for the ride. In the 15 years or so they've been doing it, they've never had more than a nasty case of poison oak. The occasional puking after too many s'mores and a bedwetter once in a while. So, when he came straight to my house the evening after a camp, with huge bags under his eyes, and looking paler than I'd ever seen, I knew something was up. Since I teach at the school where a lot of the kids attend, my first thought was that something had happened to one of them, and I was already dreading the terrible news. Thankfully, everybody was fine. It was just my brother that had the scare, and he had carried on more than usual in the morning, merely stating that he must have had a bad sausage, as he had been awake all night, with terrible pains. They'd packed up and escorted all the kids home safely, ensuring they were none the wiser, just feeling bad for him, and equally for his wife, as they giggled the tent must have been full of gas. His wife was now busy with laundry and stowing the equipment, so he had to come to see me. Lucky me. Turns out, of course, there had been a dodgy sausage, and sometime in the early hours, he crept to a toilet. On his way back, feeling better, he had smelled something terrible. Something like sulfur. He couldn't work out where on earth such a powerful and obnoxious odor was coming from, and how it had just suddenly appeared. Still, he didn't want to hang around to find out, since it was, of course, in the middle of the night, and he was standing in his PJs. He was about to head back to the warmth of his bed, when he heard a low crunching sound, followed by a rumbling noise. As he was telling me this, although it hardly seemed possible given the state of him, he visibly paled even further. He explained to me it was a dog, a large black dog, that resembled more of a bear, being so big and powerful. He said it just stood there, head down and teeth bared, making this horrendous growling noise, and the smell of rotting eggs got even stronger. I could tell there was something more though, something he was holding back. A smelly wild dog would be scary, but he is used to animals. He would know how not to make eye contact, no sudden moves, etc. That couldn't be the extent of what had him looking like death. To my utmost surprise, neither of us have followed the faith we were brought up with much anymore. By now, I was beginning to wonder if he was experiencing some sort of breakdown. There's more, he told me. The dog had evil eyes, as if it had come straight from the pits of hell. These demonic entities are supposed to collect the souls of wrongdoers and drag them back down to hell with them. If you happen to encounter one, it's either going after you or somebody close by. There's no way my brother is headed anywhere but the pearly gates. so I guess this creature must have realized it had made a mistake. It took a long time for my brother to get over it, despite me trying to reassure him that the thing had come for the wrong person. It was a close call, but not something I think he will forget. I'm not really sure what to make of it all. It's bizarre, but I try not to believe in such fairy tales, although I can't refute what he said he saw, because it really affected him. And knowing my brother, he's not affected by things easily, nor is he the type to make kind of stories like this up. So, part of me believes him. I was camping at a favorite site in Tennessee. There was far more wilderness than there was campground, so you got a real sense of being close to the wild. It was the warm season, so it was expected that the nights would be unusually hot. But after a certain point, there is such a thing as too much heat that will make you suspicious, especially when it's accompanied by an orange glow. I woke up to all kinds of flickering light and heat pulsating through the thin walls of my tent. When I unzipped it, it looked as though I was in the middle of a blazing forest fire. The heat was suffocating, and I feared that I had woken up a few minutes too late to save myself. But I was still going to try. I couldn't think of anything more terrifying than being burned alive. The only thing that made sense in the moment was getting dressed to a point that I wouldn't be guilty of indecent exposure, and having feet that would be able to run across the rough terrain. No sooner had I stepped outside of my tent, ready to run, than I was confronted with the shapes of animals that began emerging from the walls of fire. At first, I thought they were unfortunate creatures that had been trapped in the blaze, but it became all too apparent that they were something else. They were moving comfortably in the fire, and they were beginning to surround me. The closest thing I could compare them to were large wild dogs. Only dogs that had dark skin, stretched across rotting, throbbing muscles, and fire. Their tongues dangling all the way to the ground, and their eyes hollow and empty black holes, with this ember glow coming from within. For a few long moments, these demons or hellhounds, whatever the hell you want to call them, were far more terrifying than the fire I felt, or the woes of experiencing pain and torment on a level that far transcend flesh. With that awareness, I dove back into my tent for something. My grandmother's Bible. Something she had made me promise I would carry around at all times. As I dove back into my tent, I immediately jolted up outside of my body, waking up in my tent. Everything was fine, clutching that Bible close to me. I was covered in sweat and grime, as if I had just been in an actual situation I perceived moments ago. In fact, my skin was even still warm, as if I had been very close to a fire. It was terrifying. I believe I had some sort of supernatural out-of-body experience, but I don't know what else you'd call it. The forest around me, that was once on fire just moments ago, was fine. Everything was dark, quiet, and serene, whereas just moments ago, everything was a blazing inferno. It was not a dream, because how do you explain the grime, the heat? I was literally clutching this Bible that was in my backpack beforehand, which means that in this vision, or whatever I had, as soon as I pulled the Bible out of my backpack, this happened. I have no idea how to explain this. Even though this was many, many years ago, it still is hands down one of the creepiest hallucinations or experiences or visions I could possibly happen to me. My mother had brought home an unusual stone statue of a dog. She was an ancient Egyptian enthusiast and jumped at the chance to own anything authentic and connected to any pyramids. Like the arrowheads you can buy for just a few bucks, from time to time, There are Egyptian relics that evidently weren't going to sell for millions. So, they end up being marketed to people like my mom. This statue looked like it was trying to be this dog-headed Anubis, but with more infernal detail than I have ever seen in any history book or National Geographic. The teeth were showing, the forehead wrenched into expression. The skin was torn and painful. It was full of holes, and I wondered if it was the work of some ancient demented art student. My mother thought it would be great to place it in the living room, as long as it did not go in my room. I would be fine with whatever she decided with, or so at the time I had thought. Very suddenly, that night, I became a restless sleeper. I would awake with a start, and not know why. I didn't recall having any bad dreams, and I hadn't heard anything. At least not at first. As those annoying nights became a pattern, I eventually began hearing something just at the edges of my awareness. Something like speech, but garbled and layered, as if several whispers were bound and gagged, and trying to have an argument with each other. I was, and still am, a master of denial. At the time, I tried to talk it up to tinnitus, but my sleep got worse, and I started waking up, seeing shadows moving in my room that had no apparent source. I drew the line when the shadows began taking a definitive shape, the form of a dog, having horns and a ghoulish face and expression, sitting in the doorway to my bedroom, waiting for me to see it before it would slowly saunter its way downstairs. I'll never forget its eyes, or a lack thereof. Just large empty black sockets where nothing was there. It's kind of like a shark's eyes. Black, lifeless, haunting. I told my mother about the visitations and how I thought it was connected to her dog relic. She wasn't repulsed, just fascinated, and that was just another reason why she and I had a hard time getting along. I couldn't talk her into fully getting rid of the thing. She settled for setting it outside. My sleep did improve, but not entirely. The shadows would tap at my window incessantly until I woke up and looked at them. They would then congeal into the shape of a dog with even longer horns than before, sometimes reminding me of a sheep's. Needless to say, I took the first chance I got to move away, out of home. Eventually, I found out that my mom eventually got rid of the statue. What she did with it, I'm not sure. I had always wanted a dog, so when my parents finally gave in and got one years ago, I was ecstatic. They told me all about having responsibility, and I did. I loved that dog with all my heart. My mom used to laugh that I had two moms now, her and Millie. Millie would growl at anybody who came up to us, putting her body between them and me in a way to protect me, which was adorable because she was so small, but it was obvious she'd do anything to look after me. She would whine if I was unhappy, bark and wag if I was excited. She was incredible, but that's not why I write to you. One day, I decided to take her on a walk down by the river. There were lots of trees to sniff on and pee, which is why we take a ball, which she'd dutifully bring me over and over again. While having so much fun, I hadn't even realized that the time was ticking, and it was beginning to get dark. Millie didn't appear to be tiring either. We could have stayed there all evening. I thought that I would give her a couple of really good throws. So I hurled the ball, and it landed just behind the tree line at the start of the wooded area next to the river. Usually, she loves heading in there to retrieve the ball, but this time, she got to the start of the trees and stopped. She went straight into defense mode, ears back, growling. I've never seen her act like that. Maybe a couple of other times, but not like this. She was clearly warning me of a danger. Something was in the woods. I'm not sure what. Whatever was in there now was getting the full-on don't mess with Millie treatment. Of course, I thought it was cute at first, because I was under the initial impression it was a squirrel, and was in no way concerned. I mean, what could possibly be in those woods that would be a threat? We don't exactly have bears or cougars around here, at least to my knowledge. So, I stepped closer, and she did something I have never seen her do. She bares her teeth at me, and made to nip me, as if to say, back off. Now, that had me slightly worried, I must admit, as she had never ever shown any animosity towards me ever. I could have wrangled a bone from her mouth, and she would let me. She had never as much even growled at me, let alone this, so I knew something was up. However, it did not deter me, and I still approached her, carefully. She barked again, and for some reason, I got the feeling from her that she wasn't angry. She was protecting. As if in answer, I saw a sudden movement in the trees, near to where I had aimed the ball. It was beginning to get dark, and obviously, it was even darker already under the canopy of leaves, and it was hard to make out exactly what was freaking out my dog. I could just about make out the form of what I suppose was an animal. Although the mass appeared so large, I couldn't possibly think what it could be. I was enlightened somewhat once I heard growling. And then, I saw exactly why she was so hellbent on protecting me. Its eyes appeared to be glowing, unnaturally. You might be thinking it wasn't a full moon or anything like that. And no, it did not stand up and start howling. It stood its ground. Glowing skin, dark fur, a strange demonic-looking face. This creature, this dog, whatever it was hideous. This thing slowly kept creeping its way towards both of us, keeping its awful demeanor, as if it wanted to kill us both. That's when my dog completely bolted in the opposite direction, running like I had never seen her run. I took off after her. Eventually, I found her cowering in a different section of woods. Whatever that thing was, I don't know what the hell it was. It didn't follow us, but we have never gone back to that section of trail that I used to walk her at, ever. All I can say is that it scared us both very badly. Something happened to me a few years ago while I was driving home, and it's made me question the existence of all things, even hell. I was coming home after having spent a few horrendous hours in the hospital, consoling my mother as her brother had been taken ill, and suddenly would likely remain there for several days until he recovered. I was there specifically for her. I couldn't stand my uncle. He was an a-hole, to put it simply. Cared about nobody but himself. I'm surprised my mom still had a relationship with him. I had stopped really any form of communication with him years ago. He'd been dead to me for a long time. But, although I wished him a drawn-out and painful death all alone, my mother meant the world to me, as if she was worried for her brother, even though to me he was one of the nastiest humans alive. I had to swallow my hatred to be there. I felt dirty as I drove home, unable to feel an ounce of sorrow for the man. It was whilst I was imagining a long hot shower in which I would scrub this nastiness off me when I saw something out of the corner of my window. It was a dog, standing by the side of the road. God only knows what kind of dog it was, because it was so enormous. Its head looked like the size of a regular dog, but the body was jet black, and appeared to have fire coming from it. As it reared its head, it looked more rotted and skeletal, like some sort of cadaver. It was horrendous. This creature was terrifying. That's when it quickly turned its head to look over in my direction, where I ducked down, hoping it did not see me. I carried on, still wondering what the hell that thing was. And you know what? Turns out that I guess I saw a hellhound. What's even creepier is hellhounds, I found out, are omens, because shortly after seeing that thing, my uncle had died, not even 15 minutes later. My mother had been trying to call me apparently, and let me know, but I didn't have reception at the time. So I'm writing this to you because I believe now I have some sort of gift of clairvoyance, where I can see these things that let me know if somebody's going to die. I'm not really sure what to think, and I would love some answers from you. Thank you.